All right, this is the beginning of everything that we talk about in this class. Cell theory is kind of the backbone of everything in AP Bio, and it always comes back to this idea and the three ideas that we're going to talk about with cell theory. So let's get into that, and then we'll talk about the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes a little bit and what makes those cells special. Cell theory has three basic tenets. One, cells are the fundamental unit of life, meaning if you are living, you have cells. The smallest individual living unit is a cell. Part two, all living things are composed of cells. That means if you're alive, you're made of cells. So this is just sort of talking about the idea of life and what constitutes being a living organism. And three, all your cells came from pre-existing cells, meaning the cells that made you, one of them came from your mom, one of them came from your dad, and when they got together, that created that initial zygote that transformed into each of the trillions of cells that make you guys up right now. And same thing goes for dogs, cats, snakes, spiders, turtles, fish, anything that's alive, trees, plants, bushes, they all come from that one individual cell. And this is just kind of the continuum that life is sort of everlasting, that people pass on their genetic information and it sort of goes on from generation to generation. When we look at cell theory, this means if you understand how one cell works, you have a basic fundamental understanding of how all cells work, and that's sort of what this whole cell theory thing is. And that's why I say this is the absolute backbone of the class, because everything we do refers back to this idea that cells are living, everything that's living is made of cells, and they all come from the older cells. And that's that whole life is continuous idea. It has to do with genetics and reproduction and all that, which we get into later in this year. Now, when we talk about cells, typically we think of cells as small things. They are little small compartments that carry out all the life processes, basic metabolism, they grow, they divide, they reproduce, they respond to stimulus, all of that stuff. And when we think about it, most cells are small. There are some larger ones here and there. I mean, eggs are pretty good sized cells. They're pretty big. I mean, if you've ever eaten an egg for breakfast, that's one cell for that chicken. So that's a pretty good sized cell when you're talking about that. But most of them are pretty dang small. And when we talk about the size of cells, we look at something called surface area to volume ratio. And roughly what we want is a large surface area and the smallest possible volume. And that does two things. Volume determines how much metabolic activity you can have, how many different reactions can be taking place inside the cell. While you want space to do that, you don't need a ton of space for that, because that always creates waste. And the second part right here is surface area determines entry and exit. Well, the last thing you want is garbage to start building up inside your cells. We want stuff to get out quick, we want stuff to get in quick. So having a large surface area allows for a lot faster diffusion. And we'll actually be doing a lab shortly about how surface area and diffusion sort of play off each other. So we'll sort of see what's going on with that in the near future. So generally speaking, smaller is going to be better, because that's going to have a large surface area compared to the volume. And anytime you have a larger surface area to volume ratio, that means you're going to be more efficient. And that is always the name of the game when it comes to cells. What's going to make the cell most efficient? Now, let's talk about some different kinds of cells. A prokaryote. All prokaryotes have these four properties. One, they have a plasma membrane. And I'm just going to tell you right now, all cells have a plasma membrane. And you may hear me say plasma membrane, you may hear me say cell membrane, you may hear me say phospholipid bilayer. Those three terms are interchangeable. All prokaryotes have to have a plasma membrane. Second thing with being a prokaryote, there's no nucleus inside the prokaryote. That's what makes you a prokaryote. Instead of having a nucleus which holds the DNA, you have kind of a nucleoid, which is an area within the prokaryote where the DNA, which is circular in structure in prokaryotes, is just sort of hanging out in the middle of the cell. The prokaryote has cytoplasm or cytosol, which is water and dissolved stuff within it, and that's just a place where all the chemical reactions within the cell can take place, and all prokaryotes have ribosomes. Ribosomes play a big role in our cells, and they do the same exact thing in prokaryotes, which this leads us to believe that prokaryotes were the first cells that were on the earth, and from those prokaryotes everything sort of diversified from there and moved on, because ribosomes make proteins in prokaryotes same way they do it in us. By the way, if you haven't figured it out yet, humans are not prokaryotes. Some prokaryotes have some other things. A cell wall is different than a cell membrane. A cell wall is a structure made of cellulose that sort of lines the outside of certain cells. All plants have cell walls. Most prokaryotes do, but not all of them. And that gives it some structure and gives it a little bit extra protection. They may have some internal membranes within their cytosol. They may have a flagella, which acts as kind of a motor for the cell to move. And they may have some cytoskeleton materials, whether it be microtubules or microfilaments, to help hold the shape of the prokaryotic cell. Now, when we compare that to eukaryotic cells, well, eukaryotes are similar to prokaryotes. Eukaryotes, which is what we are, and every animal is a eukaryote, every plant is a eukaryote, protists are eukaryotes, fungi are eukaryotes. We have some similarities. We all have plasma membranes. We all have ribosomes. We all have cytoplasm or cytosol. That's common between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Big difference, though, between the two. Eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. Membrane-bound organelles allow for compartmentalization of functions within the cell. So that makes it so that you have specific functions happening in very specific places in eukaryotic cells. Whereas in a prokaryote, all their functions just sort of happen right next to each other in the cell. That's why they're kind of simple. In eukaryotes, they're compartmentalized. The other big thing eukaryotes have is a nucleus. And you probably learned in middle school, nucleus, control center of cell. Yeah, nucleus, control center. Well, realistically, what the nucleus does is it keeps the DNA organized. And it keeps the DNA in one place. DNA in eukaryotes always has to stay inside the nucleus, and that's what it's there for. Very different than prokaryotes, which just have the nucleoid. That is just basically DNA just sort of hanging out in the cytosol. Again, we'll go over the membrane-bound organelles. The big thing there is a compartmentalization. That plays a huge role because it allows for efficiency within our cells. When you have trillions of cells inside your body, efficiency is going to be king. So making sure each organelle has a specific function and that function only happens there plays a very important role into how we function. As we move forward in this section, we'll talk briefly about different organelles and different features of the cells, and a lot of this stuff should be reviewed for you. We're going to be testing chapters 4 and 5 together, so we'll do that with the diffusion stuff, and we talked a little bit about how diffusion is important for the cell. We'll go more into that in chapter 5. Hope you guys are having a good afternoon. I'll see you in class.